Hello everyone, this is JF. Today we're going to talk about the question of what is white. What do people mean when they say white European? Because this is a lipstick, it's white. This is also white, it's hair gel. But you'll see that the hair gel is slightly whiter than the lipstick. And this leads to unclear boundaries. What is truly white? Sit down, relax. We're going to talk about this question. The first thing to note is that when we talk about whiteness from the perspective of an ethno-state, it doesn't really matter what is the white race as a whole, unless you want to be a pan-European white advocate of the kind of Richard Spencer, who will say, my state will be for all descendants of all European whites. But the reality of history is that when a white ethno-state sees the day, it's probably going to be in a certain historical context for a certain subcategory of whites. For example, if Quebec had separated from Canada, that would have been a home for French-Canadian, Québécois people. And so, how large do we make the boundaries of whites from a European perspective wouldn't have mattered that much, because the Québécois state would be mostly for Québécois people. Same thing if a small country in Europe was to decide to separate from Europe and become a white ethno-state, it would either be a country with mostly Nordic Europeans, or it would be an Eastern country with Russians or people who are close to Russians genetically. So most of the time, if a white ethno-state shows up, it will not have to resolve the ultimate question of what is white. And the reality is that there are many levels of genetic division that we can arbitrarily choose to value. And today we'll see that essentially there's enough genetic distinction within the entire set of European countries to draw the border wherever we like. There's enough genetic distinction to justify separating French people from English people. There's enough genetic distinction to distinguish between French and English and Russians. There's enough distinction to distinguish between white Americans and Jewish Americans, even if they are white. So the first thing we'll throw to the trash is this question of whether to be white, whether whiteness is everyone who has white skin. That's not what people mean when they say a white ethno-state. It's not what people mean when they say the white race. Obviously, there is a range of people who have browner and browner skin between Western Europe down to Iran. And we could call all of this the Caucasian race, as it was once called, in a kind of outdated classification of humans. But we don't have to. And most people who talk about a white ethno-state would not include Iranians, even if, yes, they share genetic similarities with Europeans more than a Japanese would, but they are distinguishable genetically. The first thing we'll look at is, well, let's look at this other slide here. So the important thing to distinguish when we talk of genetic plots, there's two types of them that we will view today. There is the plots of genetic distance and the plots of called principal component analysis. They are very different and they allow you to reach different conclusions, but it's important not to mix up what these two graphs tell you. So let's start with a graph of genetic distance. This is the closest thing you can get from understanding the sequence of evolutionary events that led to different groups. Because genetic distance, if it's well made, what they will do is usually they will choose a subset of genes that are well fit to the question. So what's a good gene to fit into a genetic distance studies in human? It's a gene that is not exactly the same everywhere on Earth, but that doesn't vary too much also. So it's a gene between the genes that vary not at all throughout the human population, because then everyone is going to end in the same group. But you also have genes that vary just too much. So typically what they will do for a genetic distance, they will choose a gene that has variability that is illustrative enough of the last 100,000 years, because that's the kind of variance we're interested in to build our graph. Now, some of the graphs you'll see are based on thousands of genes. Some of the graphs are based on 20 genes. But it's pretty much almost always the same result, because if you don't reach the same result with these graphs, then someone made an error. Someone didn't choose a fit gene, or there was too much of a subset of gene obfuscating the greater image that you can get when you look at n of genes. Now, when you look at genetic distance, you'll see that, and I want to draw here. So typically the largest categorization that we can get, which would include all people who could be considered Caucasians, will include the Indians, the people between the Indians and Europe. So that's the Indians are here, the Iranians and Greek are here, and then the Europeans. So you have the Basque, the Italians, and the Danish and English. Now, you don't have to accept this as being a natural categorization. You don't have to necessarily include the Indians. You don't have to include the Lap. You don't have to include the Berber and the North African. You don't have to include even the Sardinian. But as you get closer and closer, you have to draw the line somewhere. And so if you get rid of the Indians not being part of the white race, the white European race, okay, well then you will also have to get rid of all the people that were above. Now, as you get closer to what really is uncontestably white people from Europe, which are the English and the Danish, you're gonna have to make choices. So do you include the Southwest Asian? Do you include the Iranian? And I've seen that Sargon was asking the problem of Greeks. So are Greeks white? Well, if you get rid of the Iranian as part of the white race, you will also get rid of the Greek. Now, here you have a Basque. So Basque are pretty much within the nuclei of what we're interested in, into outlining the cluster of genes that most people would agree on is the white race. The Basque people, by the way, are my ancestors. So Basque people they live at the border between France and Spain. And the ancestor that I have who left France to come to Quebec to populate North America were Basque. So I mean, it's your choice. You can decide to eliminate Basque and Italians, but then you're left with the white race being essentially English and Danish people. So personally, when I think of the white race, I don't necessarily think of Iranians and Greek. I think of the Western and Northern white Europeans, which includes Basque, Italians, Danish, English, and of course, not present on this graph, you will have Norway, you will have France, people who descend from people who lived in these countries for thousands of years. So that's my own personal take, but as you see, you can draw the boundary wherever you like. Now there comes the question of Jews who live in Europe. Are they genetically distinct from the European populations? And the answer is yes, they are. So let's say you regroup, and this is again a tree of genetic distance. You see that Russians, French, Basque, they tend to cluster together. They are very close on the tree. Northern Italian and Sardinian also very close to the other. So you could very well draw your boundary for the white race here. Now you have the Jews here, Ashkenazi Jews. You can see that they're not very far from Turks and Greeks. That's due to the history of the Jewish people. They inherit genes from males who came from the Middle Eastern area. And they did live in Europe, but they lived in reproductively isolated societies for hundreds of years. They tend to reproduce together, and so they have a distinct genetic signature that clearly places them closer to Turks and Greeks than it places them within the white European people. So again, it's your choice. If you want to define white as being everyone who has white skin, you're going to include people, and you're going to have to set a threshold somewhere along where the Indians are, and you might include the Jews. So Jews are Caucasian in the large sense of the word, but they are genetically distinct from Europeans, white Europeans. Now, let's leave the genetic distance trees, which are very useful to study the distance between people genetically, and let's enter the world of principal component analysis. Principal component analysis is less instructive in terms of distance. So whenever you see groups that are distant from each other on this axis, it doesn't necessarily mean that the distance is linearly related. The distance on this axis does not necessarily reflect a genetic distance overall. What these axes are useful for is, all you have to ask yourself when you look at this graph is, can I see a spot? Can I see the Russians being isolated from the French? If yes, then it means you have easy and almost, in fact, perfect genetic analysis that would allow you to make the call, this guy is Russian, this guy is French, or of French descent and of Russian descent. So these PCA analyses, typically they will be made on hundreds of thousands of single letter differences in DNA. And they will be plotted on two axes, which are the two axes where looking at these hundreds of thousands of differences in the variance maximizing way. So that means you take every letter of DNA and you say, okay, how does it contribute to the variance of my groups? And the letter of DNA will be classified in a certain way, giving you a certain score on the x-axis. And essentially, the principal component analysis graph allows you to view these hundreds of thousands of differences between humans into a single line, the line that allows the most distinction possible. So the way to really interpret this is, if I see a group here, Russians, and I see a group here, French, they are very well isolated on the two first principal component, and therefore they are different genetically. So the French are here, the Basque are here, my own ancestors, the Basque. The North Italians are here, very well distinguished. Now I want you to look at the ASH, the red dots here. These are Ashkenazi Jews. And look at how they overlap with the Greeks and the Turk. And then you have you have Syrians, you have Middle Eastern people, Middle Eastern area, Iraq, Iran, Palestinians, and Sardinians here. So what this graph tells you is there is easy genetic test available that would allow you to make a almost 100% call, not just on whether people are white, but whether people are Russian, French, Basque, North Italian, etc. Now you may wonder, are these distinctions maintained in the US? Well, yes, they are. So the distinction, for example, between people who have no Jewish ancestry, here in red, and people who have 4 Jewish grandparents, here in blue. Completely distinct on the 2 principal component analysis, the 2 first principal component analysis. So what you see in terms of distinction here is actually just a part of the data. It's the best part to distinguish, but it's just a part. So keep in mind, the authors of this study, they stated, we essentially can tell for sure with almost perfect accuracy whether you had Jewish grandparents or not. In fact, just having 1 Jewish grandparent can be distinguished from most people who have no Jewish ancestry. And if you have 2 Jewish grandparents, we can easily distinguish you from people who don't have Jewish ancestry. So the question of whether Jewish people in American society are genetically distinguishable is pretty clearly answered by this study. Yes, they are. Now there was a question coming from one of our fans, Vlad, who is also starting his YouTube channel, and he was asking about the Russians, the Slavs, the Hungarians. So would they be part of the white race? Well, the answer is there's enough distinction to distinguish them from white Europeans. But there's also enough similarity that if you decide that you make your circle wide enough, you can very well include the Russians. So that's another PCA analysis. You can see US people here. This is again looking at hundreds of thousands of genes. You can see Russians here. You can see Jewish people here. So again, they show this distinct signature from the other American people. You can see the ADJ here. ADJ is a people, I believe, living living north to Georgia. They are within the Russia right now, but they are distinct from Russian people genetically, and they live just on the border of the sea north to Georgia. And here you have the French. So really, the distinction is there genetically. You can say, this is the white race. Let's give it another color. You can say, this is the white race. Americans, non-Jewish Americans, Russians, French. And of course, here you can say, these are Middle Eastern people. The Jews, the Middle Eastern people, the Palestinians are here in green. So there's enough distinction. You can choose whatever you want, and there's not a truth about what the white race is, but there are truths about how people are distinguishable from one another. So let's look more specifically about the Slavs. because Vlad, I believe, would be qualified as a Slav. I don't know where he would fall on that graph, but he would probably qualify as a Slav, and he was wondering, will I be included in the white race? Well, there is enough genetic distinction between the Slavs, those that form most of the Russian genetic pool, and the West European to distinguish them, which doesn't mean that they have to be included in a separate race. So in A here, what you have is the complete genome analysis. In B, what you have is the Y chromosome analysis, which means the chromosome that only gets inherited by males. And in C, you have the mitochondrial analysis, which is only the chromosomes that get inherited by females. Let's just look at the whole chromosome, because that's what I prefer. It shows an illustration of the entire population. So you see French people here. You see West Slavs here. You see Finn people here in the northern part of Europe. And then you see various regions in Russia, Volga region, East Slavs, South Slavs. So there are clear genetic distinctions, and you can see it even better in the Y chromosome. Germans are here, English are here, French are here. There's enough genetic distinction here. You can distinguish these people genetically. Now, then it becomes an arbitrary choice. What's the white race? Is it this? Or is it this? Or is it this? These people differ enough for us to make the claim that any group that we can draw around these circles is potentially a valuable and informative group. Now, I was talking about the European people, and I wanted just to show you the part of that study which I discussed earlier. They say a new genetic analysis has now filled in another piece of the origins puzzle, pointing to European women as the principal female founders and to the Jewish community of the early Roman Empire as the possible source of the Ashkenazi ancestors. So as we've seen on the graphs of genetics, Jewish people from Europe are, in terms of genetics, they are halfway between Middle Eastern people and European people. And in fact, when we look at mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome analysis, it becomes very clear why. It's because men from the Middle Eastern area around Jordanian current Israel just moved to Europe and made love to European white women. This is what led to Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry. The finding establishes that the women who founded the Ashkenazi Jewish community of Europe were not from the Near East, as previously supposed, and reinforces the idea that many Jewish communities outside Israel were founded by single men who married and converted local women. So that's what a Jewish European and Jewish American is. It is the union between a traveling Middle Eastern man and a local white woman. The Ashkenazim therefore resemble Jewish communities in Eastern Africa and India, and possibly also others across the Near East, Caucasus, and Central Asia, which also carry a substantial fraction of maternal lineages from their host communities. Despite widely differing interpretations of autosomal data, these results in fact fit well with genome-wide studies, which imply a significant European component, with particularly close relationships to Italians. As might be expected from the autosomal picture, Y chromosome studies generally show the opposite trend to mitochondrial DNA. So what they're saying is, we look at the genes that are only inherited by women, the mitochondrial DNA, and we look at the genes that are only inherited by males, the Y chromosome. And there is a contrast. The Y chromosome comes from Middle Eastern area. The mitochondrial DNA comes from Europe. And that's because there was sexual intercourse between males from Middle Eastern areas and women from Europe. And again, we go back to our... So here the conclusion of the study, where I showed that there was clear difference between American Jews and other white Americans. Here we show that within Americans of European ancestry, there is a perfect genetic corollary of Jewish ancestry, which in principle would permit near perfect genetic inference of Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry. In fact, even subjects with a single Jewish grandparent can be statistically distinguished from those without Jewish ancestry. So this is the signature of a very isolated reproductive behavior, where the non-Jews were breeding together and the Jews were breeding together. Not much mixing. Again, from another study, which looks at various groups that we've discussed, you again see that the Ashkenazi Jews are very well separated and well distinguished from the French, very distinguished from the Spaniard, the French Basque, and the Russians. So you have a very good ground to say that Ashkenazi Jews are somewhere between the Middle Eastern people and the white Europeans. Now, one other question that came when I was preparing this video is what will happen with V? What about Romania? Well, Romania is right here. So you can see that the Romanian people really has a distinct genetic signature. They are you can easily tell them apart from other Europeans. And for example, those are Russians. So the question, do we kick V from the white race? Well, it depends. I mean, if you want to include the French, the Spanish, the Slovaks, the people from Belgium, the Russians, there's a way you can draw the white race without the Romanians. There's a way you can kick V from the white race. There's also a way you can draw the white race to include Romanians. So the question of whether we include or exclude V will be up to history, but there is good genetic ground to do it. The facts are there. Clearly, the Romanian people is a distinct people genetically from the French, the German, the people in the UK, the Russians. It's a totally different thing. So what you need to keep in mind is that if an ethnostate shows up wanting to protect white people, it will probably show up in a historical context with there's a certain ethnicity, a certain type of white people who will build this ethnostate and who will prevail as a majority in this ethnostate. However, if you wanna define a pan-European white solidarity movement the way Richard Spencer wants to do, you have the genetic grounds to do it. There is a way we can tell apart, both between a French and an English, or at the wider scale between generally a Western European and a Slav. And then there is also ground to tell apart a white person from Russia or Western Europe from a Middle Eastern man, and in fact including even Jews that have been living in Europe for hundreds of years. So I hope that this gives you a good introduction on what is white, as far as I'm concerned. So the genetic data is pretty clear. We can distinguish between people with French ancestry. Even within the French people, we can distinguish Basque, and we can then distinguish Spaniard, and we can distinguish English people, and we can distinguish Germans, and we can distinguish Russians, but we can also distinguish within Russia. There are very distinct genetic signature across these countries. But what's important to remember is that the genetic data is so detailed, in fact, that it's not because we can distinguish that we want to. And someone could very well say that Western Europeans form a certain race, a genetic group with distinct characteristics. Someone might be more inclined to include Finns and Swedish people, and someone might say this includes Russians too. And someone might even say that the largest definition of Caucasian also includes people from the Middle East and even people from Northern Africa. These groups are embedded within one another, and the genetic data is good enough to allow you any level of division. I will say, personally, when I think of the white race, I think of people in Western Europe mostly and Northern Europe. That's how I think of the white race. And I do think that Russians are also part of it. But I know that they are genetically distinct. And then when I think of Middle Eastern people, I think more or less roughly around this circle. And when I think of Asians, that's who I'm thinking about. And when I think of Africans, Sub-Saharan Africans, that's who I'm thinking about. But the divisions that are allowed by the genetic data are much more precise. They allow a lot of plasticity in our concept of what is white. And I encourage everyone to think about these questions, reflect about it, and also don't let yourself just be guided by genetic data. Know that the genetic data is there to support almost any arbitrary level of divisions you may want. And that ultimately, when we talk of a white ethnostate, when we talk of white people having a sense of identity, we're also talking about their ethnicity, what they identify with, the form of societies they build. So keep an open mind about all this, and yeah, that's what I had to say today. Have a great day.
Breathing downtown to a wasteland.